So thank you very much to you all for joining us today. This is a joint seminar of the Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence and the Exeter Center for the Study of the Life Sciences here at the University of Exeter. My name is Sabina Leonelli and I will be chairing this meeting. And we are absolutely delighted today to have Ed Humphreys visit us. He is the Director General for Regulation of the UK National Statistics Authority. He's been in that position since 2014, which I would say put in a wonderful position to talk about some of the most incredible succession of challenges that this country has seen, concentrated in less than a decade. I'm not sure I would envy him that position, but we've been very lucky to have Ed visit us over the years a few times and talk about his work. And indeed is a signal of how fast things are moving on the front of statistics and its regulation and governance in the UK, that every time Ed visits Exeter, like we have a completely new set of issues to look at, which is fascinating. And we hope that we can give you good feedback also, Ed. So thank you very much for being with us today.
So it's really good to speak to you this afternoon. And as Sabina says, I've always really enjoyed speaking to colleagues in Exeter. I've, I think, done 2 or 3 visits, given a few presentations, just a really fruitful exchange. So when the idea of doing this presentation came about, it was in the wake of a review that we did of the exam algorithms, and that seemed to be quite a good topic. Actually, as we've got closer to delivering this seminar, I decided to do something a bit different. So actually, I'm going to slightly depart from the advertised title. The advertised title is all about setting exam grades by algorithms and what is learned from that. What I've decided to do is to go wider and think about 4 apparently disconnected phenomena or events in the world of data and statistics in the UK, and then just explore with you how they might be tied up. The first of those is the exam algorithms. The second is the work that we've done during the pandemic on data and statistics in the pandemic. The third is slightly more general, and that is the work of economists in particular, to think about going beyond GDP, not just measuring GDP, but measuring something wider. And then finally, I want to talk about, or the 4th thing is data abundance. So just as we're going there, those are the 4 examples: the algorithms, this idea of data abundance, going beyond GDP, and there's a well-known political figure making a statement about the number of tests that the UK will deliver. If we move on to the next slide, can I just say a little bit though about who I am? So I'm the head of an organisation called the Office for Statistics Regulation, which is the regulatory arm of a public sector body called the UK Statistics Authority. And OSR, the Office for Statistics Regulation, is the UK's regulator for official statistics. And our job is, as it says here, promote and safeguard the production and publication of official statistics. And just to avoid being asked this question, to be clear, we are separate from ONS. We don't produce statistics. The way to think about it is that ONS produce the statistics, they measure the population or they measure the economy, and we check they're doing it in the right way. And we do the same for all the other government departments, like the Department for Health and many others who also produce statistics. So we can move Charlotte onto the next slide, please. You'll see when this slide appears that we do 3 types of activity. In the green segment, we look at how statistics are produced. And our phrase is, we uphold trustworthiness, quality and value of statistics and data. So that's kind of involves setting standards and then checking standards are being complied with. The second thing we do, and that's the grey box at the bottom, is we protect the role of statistics in public debate. And that's about how statistics are used. It involves us stepping into situations where statistics are being used in a way that might misinform or mislead the public. And the third thing we do in the dark blue quadrant here is that we think about how statistics are valued. In other words, we think about the public good provided by statistics, and we have a research set of activities there. So that's kind of our role. We can move on to the next slide. The final generic thing I'd say is that we have a code of practice for statistics, which by law all of government must comply with, and it's got 3 pillars. It's got a trustworthiness pillar, which is about the organizational context, the organizational governance, the processes that produce statistics. It's got a central quality pillar, which is about the data and the methods that support good statistics. And the third pillar is value, which is about statistics that support society's needs for information. And that's really about relevance, about accessibility, about insight. It's about all the things that make the statistics not just trustworthy and high quality, but valuable to society. So we always look for those 3 things: trustworthiness, quality, and value. If we could move on, please, Charlotte. The first of the 4 scenarios I want to talk about is living in a data abundant world. And this is a very commonplace thing for people to observe, that we live in a data abundant world, that we are surrounded by data that we ourselves create, or that are created about us. Sometimes it's called exhaust data, data that is sort of just the traces we leave as we go through our lives, being picked up and being used. Sometimes data are called the new oil. And I think a very striking thing, if we can move on to the next slide, is how frequently we see an image like the image which is about to appear on the next slide. There we go, which is people, I mean, these people may be not necessarily looking at data, but they are engaging with devices which have the potential to both record what they are doing and convert it into data, and also to be recipients of data themselves. So data is becoming a much more abundant feature of the world in which we live. Now that's, in a way, a societal phenomenon. It's not directly relevant to my work. I think it does bear on some of the things I'm going to talk about later, though. So I think the fact that we are, or the observation that we are living in a data abundant world, I think is very important to understanding the lives of statistics, the life of statistics in contemporary society. The next thing I want to talk about is what was advertised for this seminar, which is the exams in 2020. And so if we can move on to the introductory slide next, please, Charlotte. The backstory is, just so you are all aware, in case you've not picked this up, in March of 2020, the summer cycle of exams typically taken by school children, those exams were cancelled, and qualification regulators were told that they had to calculate grades. So instead of people taking exams and the exams being marked, the qualification regulators were told by government that they had to find a way of calculating grades with no exams. So that's the basic scenario. The approach, in very simple terms, to solving this problem was to award grades based on teacher assessments and other evidence, and then to standardise those assessments. And a bit more detail, there were 2 sources of input information: the prior attainment at the school, so the historic track record of that school's students in passing exams. So if it was a school where everybody always got an A, that would be one piece of evidence on prior attainment. If it's the sort of school where everybody failed, that would be another piece of prior attainment. So prior attainment at the school. And then secondly, for this summer's cohort of students, for teachers to rank the pupils. So in a class of 30, the teachers would say who the number 1 pupil was, who the number 2 pupil was, all the way down to number 30. So the teacher's judgment, the teacher's assessment of how the pupils rank. The algorithm would then take those 2 inputs and do 2 things. It would define the distribution of grades for a centre, for a school, based on the statistical model of prior attainment. So it would say this school typically has 80% A's and 20% B's. That's a hopeless simplification, but that's the sort of idea. 20% 80% A's and 20% B's. We'll then take the rank order and take the top 80% of the rank order will get A, and the bottom 20% will get B. That's basically what the algorithm did. So that was all developed. In fact, when, as you will all recall, the results were released, there was a public outcry. We've got some of the images here. I love the phrase, "Your algorithm doesn't know me," which somebody has written on their placard there. But you had a real sense of public grievance, which resulted in the whole algorithm being ditched and the system moving on to a more the basic teacher assessment approach. Why did we do this review? Well, algorithm became a dirty word. The system said, we'll set your grades using a statistical model, and people, students, parents, the public, said algorithm was a dirty word. Given that it's our role to uphold confidence in statistics, it felt important that we should look at this. So we did, and we have undertaken a very extensive review. Our key principles for this review are four, and I'm going to go through them in turn. It's not just about England. There are enormous challenges. This isn't a technical exercise, and public confidence is at the heart of things. So let me go through those in turn on the next slide, please, Charlotte. So people typically talk about this as something that Ofqual did, but it's really worth remembering, and our review brings this out very strongly, that there are 4 exam regulators relating to the 4 parts of the United Kingdom. Ofqual for England, the Scottish Curriculum Authority for Scotland, Qualifications Wales for Wales, and the SEA for Northern Ireland. And they all did something along the lines I've described, but with subtle differences between them. And in fact, actually, the Scottish model was a bit more distinct, and the other 3 were quite similar, but there were 4 distinct models. So that's the first thing we wanted to bring out, is that it's not just what Ofqual did, it's what all 4 of them did, and they all had the same result, that the algorithm models were dropped. We can move on to the next slide. Before we all rush to critique what they did, it's important to remember that there were enormous challenges. The exam regulators who built these models were told they had to maintain standards and not disadvantage any groups. And by maintaining standards, that means produce a distribution of grades broadly similar to what was seen in prior years, to not have any grade inflation. Secondly, they didn't have the option of learning over multiple iterations. Now, normally when you build a model, decision model, you have that opportunity. You trial some data, develop it, see how it works, try a bit more, and so on. They had no option. They had to do a single grade on a single day. That single grade point is important too, because on a statistical model-based approach, you might assume that a range would be a more plausible way of coming up with an estimate than a single point grade, because the single point grade collapses lots of information into a single mark. Another point which makes this enormously challenging is that, of course, there are huge variability in exam results in a normal year, that somebody has a bad day or somebody has a good day, somebody doesn't turn up, the wrong questions come up for them. And that produces some departures from what teachers predict. Teachers might predict for a pupil a certain grade, but because of the good day or the bad day phenomenon, there's a variability from that prediction. That's very, very hard. That natural randomness is very, very hard to capture and replicate in a model for obvious reasons. And my final 2 points about enormous challenges are tight timescales and limited data. And so all of this means that we shouldn't glibly say they messed it up, what idiots. I think it's much more complicated than that. Charlotte, if we can move on to the next slide. The third principle we took into this is, very quickly we realized that to call this a mutant algorithm masks 3 things which are not really about the coding, not really about the structure of the model at all. The first is data quality. And the most important feature about data quality is that the ranking of pupils in a class of 30 from 1 to 30 had never really been done by teachers before in any formalized way that was going to lead to exam grades. So this was the first time it had ever been done, and there was really very little evidence on how good a ranking process was in replicating final exam grades. There was some evidence, but it was very weak evidence about how good that was. So there's an immediate question about data quality. The second issue, which is not really technical, is one of transparency and governance. There was a reasonable amount of communication around the process that was being followed, but I think it's fair to say that for the people who received their grades, this felt like quite a black box. And indeed, one of the points we make in our review is that testing the public acceptability of this approach was very hard, because you could gather people in focus groups in a room and say, do you think this approach we defined sounds okay? And people would say yes, but you couldn't in that focus group scenario replicate the experience of somebody who's expecting an A, and when they get their text message or their email and they've got to see how they feel. That's very hard to replicate, the kind of lived experience. And we think around that transparency and governance, public acceptability, there's a really significant issue. And then the third thing, and we really do think this was a mistake, was the lack of a human in the loop. And by human in the loop, we mean a human review of resulting grades to question and challenge any outliers. And by outliers in this context, we mean really, really significant grade shifts for individuals. So an individual whose prediction might be 2 A's and a B, who ends up through the model getting awarded 3 E's, very significant downgrades. There was no human capacity to step into that case and say, why has the model produced that result? And do we want to exercise human judgment to moderate that result? They didn't allow themselves that. And as a result, a small percentage of the cases had this rather extreme downgrading, but they were the cases that led to the public outcry. And so we think that the generic advice in all of these cases would be to keep a human in the loop, to do that sort of sense checking across the small number of cases which are extreme outliers. So I'm just coming to the end of the exam algorithms. This is my last slide. Our conclusion was ensuring public confidence is never just about the technical design. It's really about a whole end-to-end process involving the learning points being be open and trustworthy, be rigorous, and think about quality, data quality throughout, and always think about public acceptability and public value. Now, I'm sure you'll have lots of questions about this case study, but it's not where I want to end this tour of issues with data and statistics. I want to move on to a third case study, and that's the case study of That's Your Bloody GDP. So if you move on to the next slide, please, Charlotte. This is the famous statement by a member of the public being told that leaving the European Union would be bad for the UK's GDP, and her reply, apocryphally, was, well, that's your bloody GDP, meaning GDP doesn't really mean anything to me. And that's your bloody GDP is part of a broader narrative that measuring the economy in purely economic output terms might be missing something about how people live their lives. So there's a very famous report by Stiglitz and Fitoussi for the OECD, which is about measurement beyond GDP. There's very interesting developments in prosperity measurement. The Institute for Global Prosperity have just put out a report along those lines. So there's a lot of thought now about saying the standard measurements of GDP don't engage with the way people live their lives, and that we are missing something. So that's my third scenario about statistics in people's lives. So we could just quickly move on. The fourth one is, in a way, the most prominent one in all of our minds. It's the pandemic. And I'm just going to quickly run through the pandemic. So the pandemic is a really wonderful illustration for someone who's like me, spends my life with statistics, to show that statistics are important. This is the coronavirus dashboard published by the UK government. It's, I think, received over 20 million unique visits since the start of the pandemic. And I'm sure you yourself, or you know people who look at this and can quote it. They can say, or they can drill down into it to their local area, and they can say, oh, the rate's down in my area, or the rate's up. People are engaging with these statistical pictures in a way that we haven't really seen before. But of course, that puts an onus on the way statistics are created and communicated, because they are powerful. So if we move on, Charlotte, because numbers have become so important, there is a danger of what we call number theatre, just picking a big number and trying to stick with it. Here's Matt Hancock, who I think has probably been in the news a bit already today. So just to make his day a bit worse, here's what he said in April last year, April 2020. I'm now setting the goal of 100,000 tests per day by the end of this month. That's a typical political piece of communication of a number. Big number, I can now commit to it. We looked at this and we concluded that actually the reported outturn against that commitment was not very reliable. We concluded that the aim seems to be to show the largest possible number of tests, and that's why we think they're so widely criticised and mistrusted. I'll be happy in a question and answer to explain why we concluded this, but if I could say it in a simple phrase, double counting. There was a very big double counting problem within these numbers. So if I could just move on, another thing that the pandemic has taught us is about equality of access. So if you recall, in October last year, Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance did a presentation where they announced a new English lockdown starting on the 5th of November. They did the briefing on the 31st of October, and lots of new data and statistics. Those data and the slides underpinning them were not published until the 3rd of November. We stepped into that space and said, that's just not good enough. That if you are asking the public to very significantly modify their behavior, and you're presenting your version as a decision maker, or the evidence on which you've based that, you need to make that evidence publicly available at the time that you're saying it. You can't leave people waiting 3 days. And as it turned out, when the data were made available, there were remaining questions about some of the projections that had been used about the number of deaths and so on. It became extremely controversial, and we put a tweet out on this, which had about 160,000 views, where we said, you really need to make sure there's an equality of access here, that people can access, all people can access the data at the same time. And then if we move on, one final thing to say about the pandemic is I've sort of dwelt on some bad news. Vaccines are good news, not simply because they've been rolled out very extensively across the UK and faster than in some other countries. The data that are published around vaccines are really strong and good. Not perfect. In fact, we published a letter today to England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, encouraging improvement. But I think when you actually go on to the website and look at what's published, you'll be amazed by how much detail is available about how vaccines are being rolled out, to who's had a second dose, and so on. It's really, really fantastic. So that's the pandemic. And I'm just now going to go on to what do I think is connecting these 4 stories: general data abundance, the exams, and the GDP, and the pandemic. I think what connects them, and if we just roll forward through the animations, please, Charlotte, is that there's 2 or 3 more, that's it. We're in a world where we're concerned that data are everywhere. These quotes are all quotes that I found from a quick Google search of data everywhere. Analysts doing presentations where they said phrases like data everywhere and not a drop to drink, or not a bit to help, or the rather clumsy, not an insight to take action upon. This is a kind of generic anxiety that we have, that data are abundant but not helpful. If we can move on, Charlotte. I think that's feeding into an environment where we're all becoming armchair epidemiologists. We don't simply want to be recipients of data, but we want to have our own view of it. The best example I can give of this, and I'll next time I do this presentation, I'll have a screenshot of it. Earlier this week, The Sun, the tabloid newspaper The Sun, published an update on where the R number was, reproducibility number was, and what the latest movements in the R number meant. Now, if the Sun newspaper thinks that its readership is interested enough in the R number to engage with an article in the Sun about where the R number is going, I think we're a nation of armchair epidemiologists. We're a nation of people who want to understand and make sense of these data. We don't simply want to be passive recipients, but we want to have our own view of it. The third thing I want to say in terms of what connects my 4 scenarios, if we could move on, please, Charlotte, is this phrase, a socio-technical approach, which is a new phrase to me. It came to me from Carly Kind, who's the head of the Ada Lovelace Institute. When we published our report on algorithms and exams, she said, I was really impressed with the socio-technical approach taken by this report. I'd never really come across that phrase before, but it sounded like a good thing. So I was happy that she said it and we retweeted it. And then I started to think about it and think it actually describes extremely well the kind of environment that we're in, this mix of the highly technocratic with the highly populist, and therefore the kind of approach we need to take to all data problems to thrive through it. So this is what I understand by a socio-technical approach, and I suspect there are people here who are listening who know much more about this than me and can adapt or correct or update what I've written here. But I understand by it that a socio-technical approach is, don't just focus on technical aspects on the coding, which is what lots of people who deal with algorithms will do, that it's a problem of coding or of formulae or of technique. Don't just do that. Certainly avoid anything which is pseudo-technical, the pseudo-technical big number, 100,000 a day type approach. That's not socio-technical, that's pseudo-technical. But by the same token, be wary of a purely sociological approach, which I've characterized here as the value of algorithms being socially constructed, which is possibly true, but I don't think it's terribly helpful in navigating an environment where some understanding of what's going on in terms of the way data are processed is important. I think another feature of the socio-technical world is that actually identity and representation in identity and its representation in data matter an awful lot. And in fact, 2 of my 4 scenarios are explicitly about that. That's your bloody GDP is effectively someone saying, I don't see myself represented in the data that you are using to describe me. And similarly, that great quote that I picked out from the student, your algorithm doesn't know me, is about someone who's saying that the data or the model imperfectly represents the individual. So I think socio-technical approach involves thinking through this issue of identity and representation in data. And I think it involves situating technocratic questions in a broader context of public dialogue, understanding and acceptance, which is what our work tries to do. All of the things I've talked about our work involve not neglecting the technical, but situating it within a broader notion of public confidence. That's what our code of practice is about, with trustworthiness, quality and value. So I'd say that Carly Kind was right, that the socio-technical approach pervades what we do. So I'm going to stop there. I think I might have a couple more slides, but I think we can just skip through them because I don't think they convey much more. So Charlotte, if we could just quickly move on. I'll just repeat the pillars of the code of practice. Oh, and yeah, that's great. Thank you. I'll pause there. I've rattled through probably too quickly to leave time for questions and answers. So if I've skipped over something or got something hopelessly wrong or left you with lots of doubts, now's your chance. Thank you very much.